being inside a cinema, it's almost like there's like a religious quality to it. Like you are at mass, you are at, you're in this like shared sort of space.
My name is Sebastian Markt. I'm the head of programming at Berlinale Generation, and today I have the opportunity to speak to Igor Drljača, the director of Tabija, the White Fortress, which will be competing at Generation 14 Plus as part of this year's Berlinale selection. Hello, Igor. Welcome, at least virtually. Thank you for taking the time. To start out, what would be your way of briefly describing the film that you just made?
Well, it's a love story set in post-war Sarajevo about two young people whose choices in life have been restricted to extremes, and a city that's sort of trapped in this sort of new reality and doesn't really afford people from all stripes the fair choices. And it's about a young man who essentially is confronted with like a moral dilemma, one that kind of changes his life.
This is your third feature, and there's a strong topic in all of your work about the legacy of the war, and also of effects on people who had to flee, and the experience of migration. What's kind of new in this film is that it focuses on a generation that is born after the war. What was your desire about telling a story about these kind of characters?
This one is more about characters who were born in this sort of new space, this post-war reality, and in doing so, they're not really aware how some of these decisions, how some of these abilities to have a future have been affected by the war itself, in part because they weren't present. So there's this kind of strange ability for that war to shape realities of people that are not entirely aware of how that war shaped it. So because the film kind of deals with it's both like a social realist drama, but at the same time it's a romance film with like ghost-like elements. It kind of confronts some of these legacies in a very kind of subtle way, but it doesn't really deal with them head on. It's just a remnant of the country's current reality. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of stay away from is actually covering the war itself in a direct way, like the affect of wars from all the way from World War II, World War I, World War II, and then the Bosnian Civil War. All of those things kind of shape a generation in a way that makes the people experience this trauma over and over again. And I wanted to move away from a story or a critique on that, but it's still embedded in the subtextual sort of quality that's in that space. And somebody like Faruk, who was sort of born into the middle class, and that middle class has been decimated as a result, not just as a result of his sort of the fate he was dealt, but also because there's this erosion of the middle class post-war, and the country is still sort of stuck in this sort of Dayton paradox where civic society is really hard pressed to thrive, and it's still based on ethnopolitical sort of ideas of representation. So the country itself has all these sort of scars that linger, and young people are not entirely aware of how to operate in this space unless they sort of join this apparatus. Their generation in Bosnia is in a particular paradox, in part because there are few opportunities left for them. So leaving is an option for the rich and the well-connected, but at the same time, a lot of younger people who are in less ideal circumstances, they too are compelled to leave if they can. So they immigrate to Germany, they immigrate to other European countries, North America, Canada. There's a net loss of people each year in that country, and it's pretty radical. We're talking about like 50 to 100,000 people each year leaving. It's the worst elements of like society building is present in that space. The post-war reality didn't bring many opportunities. Like there's assumptions that it did, but it did not.
The film also makes that social contradictions that you were talking about visible in terms of the city space. There's Faruk, whom you mentioned, who lives in a kind of estate housing. We get to see sort of secluded, almost fortified housing on the outskirts. So in a way, it almost feels like this social geography of the city becomes a part of the film. It makes the city a character by itself.
So the city is constantly reinventing itself in terms of like who lives there, who occupies that space. But the young people like are not afforded those opportunities. So the city just operates in this kind of neither here nor there. I kind of wanted to capture that in a poetic way, just through the way that I think of spaces and think about the histories and the other sort of lives that intersected in those spaces, and all of them have like a very different sort of experience of that space. You still see the lingering remnants of like the communist era and how it still impacts the ability of people in that space to operate.
It's a very impressive part of the film that it knows these different registers of telling different kinds of stories. There's this element of fairy tale. There is, you also talked about it being a love story, but then there is also the social realist part, but even something like a thriller lurking.
That sort of thriller quality is something that's that was always present in the story that I wanted to tell, because the idea that chance plays like a huge role in this film, like the sort of this invisible sort of traveler, Chance, and he is tested multiple times as to like what he should do, and sort of the moral dilemma that he's confronted with kind of enables all these forces to slowly make his decision making that much harder, even though he's been sort of confronted with these questions before. It's not like it's like a first time, but here in particular, because of his feelings, his life, his life and well-being are under threat.
A few years ago, you made a documentary film that also played here in the festival, among others, called The Stone Speakers, which focuses on places of tourism in former Yugoslavia and how those places construct historical narratives. And it seems there is a connection between that film and the concerns that are also present.
When a country doesn't really know what it is, when a country doesn't really know how to celebrate specific events, because there's so many different ways of celebrating it. Not everybody tries the same dates. Not everybody tries the same history. Not everybody tries the same spaces to mean the same thing. They don't have strong anchors in their lives, right? Like they're rudderless, and it's not just the sort of the spaces that they occupy, but that's, you start to see people willing to bend rules, people willing to bend moral sort of questions, people willing to kind of operate under these very, very dubious claims, conspiracy theories. And when you operate in that space, when society grows in that space, you start to think like you're not even sure what it stands for anymore. What is the history? What is the story? And I think one of the reasons why a lot of young people actually leave Bosnia is in part because there is no anchor. Is because it's not just the opportunities. It's like after a while you start to feel that what you believed on Tuesday is not necessarily what you believe today. And you could have the best intentions, but like the forces at play are going to kind of force your hand because of the system that they live in. They live in a system that's where like private enterprise is entirely tied to the political class, and trying to separate the two is very difficult. Like for you to function in that state as a let's say as a businessman or as an entrepreneur, like you have to like abide by an apparatus that doesn't entirely make it easy for you to operate in. And that's sort of the danger of spaces like Bosnia, is that these contested spaces, like you start to see these kind of manifestations throughout the world where, like in the US, for example, where nobody really shares a history anymore. Nobody shares a same reality. Nobody looks at the reality as is. They just sort of like spin a narrative on it. And Bosnia was sort of like an early manifestation of this quandary, of this narrative. It just keeps creating more and more problematic narratives that don't allow for this young generation to thrive.
Now confronted with the impossibility of seeing films in theaters and of engaging with audiences, does it change in any way your idea of what cinema can do or what cinema is?
You're like giving 2 hours or 3 hours or an hour and a half of your life to sort of experience something, and losing that, and like this sort of seeing how losing that might come to pass is a very scary experience. That part is very scary. Like it's a very scary thought. And I'm hopeful that like this is just a blip. It's just like, cinema has survived the previous pandemic when in 1918, 1919. So it only thrived after, but it was a young art. But hopefully like things will return back to normal. And I'm hopeful that more people have opportunities to sort of see other kinds of cinema, where like, the multiplexes will be open to whoever if there's enough people interested in a particular film, they could, just order it and then have a communal experience watching it. So yeah, I think it's going to be maybe an opportunity for like new approaches to showcasing other kinds of work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
for the conversation. I hope we do get the chance to talk to audiences in Berlin at some point in the future.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more.